The affair between Sophia and Henry was merely a single, jagged piece in a puzzle of deceit that stretched far beyond the boundaries of betrayal. The detectives were certain that buried within the tangled web of secrets, lies, and betrayals lay the venomous truth that had spawned this deadly climax. In the quiet, picturesque town of New Brunswick, where everyone knows each other and secrets are hard to keep, a shocking discovery was made one fateful morning. The Miller household, known for its lively energy, was eerily silent. A delivery driver, arriving for a scheduled drop-off, found the front door slightly ajar. Concerned, the driver called out, but there was no response. With growing unease, the driver decided to step inside, only to stumble upon a chilling scene that would shatter the town's tranquility forever. Inside the home, two bodies lay lifeless in a pool of blood. Sophia Miller, the beloved wife of John Miller, and Henry Miller, her husband's stepfather. What had begun as a forbidden romance had spiraled into a deadly tragedy, leaving the town in shock and the authorities scrambling to uncover the dark secrets that led to this gruesome end. As the investigation unfolds, the line between love and betrayal blurs, revealing a web of lies and deceit that no one saw coming. On the morning of September 3, 2010, the usually serene neighborhood of New Brunswick was unexpectedly disturbed. The Miller home, typically filled with the sounds of life and laughter, was ominously silent. Curtains that were usually drawn open to welcome the morning sun remained tightly shut. There was no sign of movement, no sign of life. A delivery driver, scheduled to drop off a package at the Miller residence, arrived around 10 a.m. The driver noticed something unusual as they approached the house. The front door, which was usually closed, was slightly ajar. Initially, the driver thought nothing of it. Perhaps someone inside had left it open while carrying something inside. But as the driver called out and received no response, a sense of unease began to grow. After a few more attempts to get someone's attention, the driver hesitantly stepped inside. The silence was deafening, the air thick with an oppressive atmosphere. The living room was neat and orderly, but the unsettling quiet made everything feel wrong. As the driver ventured further into the house, they reached the staircase leading to the second floor. There, small, dark stains on the floor caught the driver's attention. Barely noticeable, but unmistakable. Blood. The driver's heart raced as they climbed the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. At the top, the door to the master bedroom was slightly ajar. With trembling hands, the driver pushed it open, and the sight that greeted them was beyond anything they had anticipated. On the large bed, two bodies lay motionless, their lifeless forms partially covered by blood-soaked sheets. A woman and a man, both clearly deceased, their bodies marred by what appeared to be multiple gunshot wounds at point-blank range. The brutality of the scene was overwhelming. Panicking, the driver stumbled back down the stairs and rushed outside, frantically calling the police. Within minutes, two patrol cars pulled up to the Miller residence, and officers Jordan and Martinez stepped out, immediately sensing that something was off. The victims were quickly identified as Sophia Miller and Henry Miller, her husband's stepfather. The discovery of their bodies in such a gruesome manner shocked the community, but for the detectives, it was the beginning of a complex and deeply disturbing investigation. Detective Chief Inspector Samuel Carter, a seasoned investigator with years of experience, took charge of the case. As he arrived at the scene, he was immediately struck by the gravity of the situation. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of robbery. This suggested that the victims knew their killer and that the attack was both personal and premeditated. The first priority was to locate John Miller, Sophia's husband, who was conspicuously absent from the scene. His whereabouts were unknown, and his silence only added to the growing list of questions. The investigation began in earnest. Every detail of the crime scene was meticulously examined, every piece of evidence carefully collected. The bloodstains on the floor, the spent cartridge casings beside the bed, the positioning of the bodies. All of it was scrutinized for clues. As the forensics team worked, Detective Carter turned his attention to the relationship between the victims. Sophia Miller and Henry Miller, stepdaughter and stepfather, had been found together in what could only be described as a compromising position. This revelation raised immediate suspicions about the nature of their relationship and whether it could have been a motive for the crime. The initial examination of the scene suggested that the victims had been killed in their sleep or caught off guard, as there were no signs of a struggle. The gun used in the crime was not found at the scene, indicating that the killer had taken it with them. With John Miller still missing and no clear suspects, the detectives knew that this case was going to be anything but straightforward. The small, quiet town of New Brunswick had just become the center of a dark and twisted investigation, one that would soon reveal secrets that had been buried far too long. As the sun set on New Brunswick, the police station buzzed with activity, the officers and detectives fully aware that every moment counted. They had to find John Miller, and they had to figure out who was responsible for the brutal murders that had shattered the peace of this once quiet community. As the investigation into the deaths of Sophia and Henry Miller began to unfold, one question loomed large. Where was John Miller? The absence of Sophia's husband at the crime scene only deepened the mystery, and locating him became the detective's top priority. Detective Chief Inspector Samuel Carter, known for his methodical approach and keen intuition, immediately ordered a search for John. His mobile phone was unresponsive, and initial inquiries with friends and relatives yielded no results. John had seemingly vanished without a trace. The longer he remained missing, the more suspicions began to form around him. Meanwhile, the forensic team continued their work at the crime scene. Every inch of the Miller home was combed for evidence. They recovered several items that might provide insight into what had transpired in the hours leading up to the murders. Among these were 2 mobile phones, one belonging to Sophia and the other to Henry. These phones, when analyzed, would soon reveal the secrets that had been hidden within the walls of the Miller home. As the day wore on, Detective Carter called a meeting with his team to discuss the initial findings. The atmosphere in the room was tense. Everyone knew that time was of the essence. "Where are we on the search for John Miller?" Carter asked, his voice steady but urgent. Detective Alice Morgan, a younger but highly capable officer, responded, "We've put out an APB on John and are checking traffic cams and toll booths in the area. So far, no hits, but we're expanding the search radius." "Good. We need to find him," Carter replied. "But in the meantime, we need to focus on what we have. Let's dig into those phones. I want to know everything: calls, texts, emails. If there's something there, we'll find it." Hours later, the digital forensics team began to uncover the truth. As they combed through the messages and call logs on Sophia's phone, they stumbled upon a series of text exchanges between her and Henry. The content of these messages was unmistakable. Sophia and Henry had been engaged in a secret affair. The text revealed the depth of their relationship, one that had grown increasingly intense and passionate over several months. Detective Carter and his team were shocked by this discovery. The affair not only provided a motive, but also painted a picture of a forbidden romance that had spiraled out of control. Sophia and Henry's relationship was far from the innocent connection of a stepfather and stepdaughter. It was something much more dangerous. The text also hinted at tension in the days leading up to the murders. Sophia had expressed guilt and fear, suggesting that their secret was on the verge of being exposed. Henry, on the other hand, seemed determined to keep the relationship alive, despite the risks. Their last exchange, sent the night before their deaths, was particularly chilling. "Sophia, we can't keep doing this, Henry. It's too dangerous. John is starting to suspect something. I'm scared." "Henry, don't worry about John. He doesn't know anything. We'll figure this out. I promise. Just meet me tonight, like we planned." This final message exchange raised more questions than answers. Did John indeed suspect the affair? Could he have confronted them that night? And if so, could it have led to murder? As the detectives grappled with these revelations, they knew they were only scratching the surface of this tangled web of relationships. Sophia's and Henry's affair was just one piece of the puzzle. To solve this case, they needed to understand not just the events leading up to the murders, but the emotional and psychological state of everyone involved. The search for John Miller continued, now with increased urgency. The possibility that he had discovered the affair and acted out of rage was becoming more plausible. But there was also the chance that he was another victim, either of his own emotions or of someone else's darker intentions. After nearly 24 hours of searching, a breakthrough came. John Miller's car was spotted by a traffic camera at a gas station on the outskirts of town. He was alone and appeared disheveled, fueling his vehicle before heading back onto the highway. The timestamp on the footage placed him there just hours after the estimated time of the murders. Detective Carter, recognizing the importance of bringing John in for questioning, immediately dispatched a team to track him down. By the time they caught up with him, John was at a motel several towns away, looking exhausted and on edge. He offered no resistance as the officers took him into custody and brought him back to New Brunswick. At the station, John was placed in an interrogation room, his hands trembling slightly as he waited for what was to come. Detective Carter entered the room, a stack of files in hand, and took a seat across from him. The air was thick with tension as Carter observed the man before him. John was in his mid-30s, with the look of someone who had been through an emotional ringer. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face drawn and pale. The usually composed and confident man now appeared broken, as if the weight of the world had finally come crashing down on him. "John," Carter began, his tone calm but firm, "we need to talk about what happened at your house." John's eyes flickered with something, fear, guilt, or maybe just exhaustion. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, his voice shaky. "We found Sophia and Henry," Carter continued. "Both of them are dead. We need to know what you know, John. Where were you last night? What happened?" At the mention of their names, John's face crumpled, and tears began to well up in his eyes. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I didn't do it," he whispered, almost to himself. "I didn't kill them." "Then tell me where you were," Carter pressed, leaning forward slightly. "Tell me what happened." John hesitated, his mind racing. "I left," he finally said. "I found out about them, about what they were doing behind my back. I confronted Henry. I was angry, but I didn't hurt them. I just couldn't stay there, so I left." Carter's eyes narrowed. "What time did you leave, John? And why didn't you call anyone? Why run?" "I don't know. It was late, after midnight," John replied, his voice breaking. "I was so angry, so hurt. I didn't know what to do. I just drove. I didn't know where I was going." The detectives continued to press John for details, but his responses were inconsistent, his memory hazy. He admitted to confronting Henry, but insisted that when he left, both Sophia and Henry were still alive. He claimed he had no idea what happened after he drove away. The inconsistencies in John's story only deepened the mystery. Was he telling the truth, or was he hiding something? His emotional state was clearly fragile, but the detectives knew that they couldn't take his word at face value. They needed to corroborate his story with evidence. As the interrogation wrapped up, Detective Carter left the room, his mind churning with the possibilities. If John was telling the truth, then someone else must have come into the house after he left. But if he was lying, then they had a killer sitting right in front of them. The investigation was far from over. With John Miller in custody, the focus shifted to verifying his alibi and digging deeper into the lives of everyone involved. The detectives knew that the answers were out there, somewhere in the tangled mess of secrets, lies, and betrayal that had led to this deadly outcome. As the investigation continued, Detective Carter and his team began to explore all possible angles. While John Miller remained a person of interest, the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than a simple crime of passion. The details were too murky, the motives too complex. They needed to dig deeper into the lives of the victims and those around them. One of the first things the detectives did was re-examine Henry Miller's life. On the surface, Henry was a respected figure in the community, a successful businessman who had taken John under his wing when he married his mother. But as the detectives dug deeper, they discovered a different side of Henry, one that was far more sinister. It turned out that Henry had a history of extramarital affairs with several women in the community. His charm and influence had allowed him to keep these relationships hidden for years. Sophia was just the latest in a long line of conquests, but their relationship had clearly gone beyond a simple affair. The text messages recovered from their phones painted a picture of a deeply emotional and tumultuous relationship, one that had become increasingly volatile in the weeks leading up to their deaths. But Henry's personal life wasn't the only area of concern. The detectives also discovered that he had been involved in several shady business deals. There were rumors that Henry had crossed some dangerous people in his line of work, people who wouldn't hesitate to resort to violence to settle a score. This raised the possibility that the murders could have been a form of retribution rather than a crime of passion. As they continued to investigate, the detectives uncovered another disturbing piece of information. Henry had been involved in a heated dispute with a former business partner, a man named Gerald Henson. Henson had lost a significant amount of money in a failed investment that he blamed on Henry. There had been threats exchanged, and it was clear that the bad blood between them had never fully dissipated. Henson, a man with a reputation for ruthlessness, quickly became a new suspect. The detectives began to explore whether Henson might have had a hand in the murders, either directly or by hiring someone to do the job for him. They knew that they needed to look into his whereabouts on the night of the murders, and whether he had any connections to John Miller or anyone else who might have been involved. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis of the crime scene continued to yield results. The team discovered traces of blood in the garage, leading them to suspect that the bodies may have been moved after the murders. This suggested the possibility of a third person being involved, someone who had come to the scene after the murders had taken place. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the detectives realized that they were dealing with a far more complex case than they had initially thought. The forbidden romance between Sophia and Henry was just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface, there were hidden motives, old grudges, and dangerous enemies that all pointed to a web of deceit and betrayal. While the detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the evidence, a breakthrough came in the form of a crucial witness, someone who had been hesitant to come forward but could no longer stay silent. Her name was Karen White, a close friend of Sophia Miller, who had known about the affair but had kept it secret out of loyalty to Sophia. Karen had been wrestling with her conscience ever since the murders were discovered. She knew that the information she held could be the key to solving the case, but she was terrified of the consequences. However, as the investigation intensified, Karen realized that she had to do the right thing. She contacted the police and agreed to meet with Detective Carter at the station. When she arrived, Karen was visibly nervous, her hands shaking as she sat down across from the detective. "Thank you for coming in, Karen," Carter said, his tone gentle. "I know this isn't easy, but anything you can tell us could be vital to our investigation." Karen took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Sophia was my best friend," she began, her voice wavering. "I knew about her relationship with Henry. She confided in me. She was so unhappy with John, and Henry made her feel alive. But I never thought it would end like this." Carter nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Did Sophia ever mention feeling threatened? Or did Henry say anything that might suggest they were in danger?" Karen shook her head. "No, not exactly. But she was scared that John was on to them. She thought he might have found out, but she wasn't sure. And there was something else. Something she said to me a few days before she died." "What was that?" Carter asked, leaning in. "She told me that Henry was acting strange," Karen said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He was more secretive than usual, and she was worried that he was hiding something from her. She thought it might have something to do with his business, but she didn't know what." This revelation sent a jolt through Carter. If Henry had been hiding something from Sophia, it could be the missing link they were looking for. "Did she say what she was going to do about it?" Carter asked. Karen nodded. "She told me she was going to confront him, ask him directly what was going on. She was tired of the secrets, tired of the lies. That was the last time I spoke to her." Carter's mind raced as he considered the implications of Karen's testimony. If Sophia had confronted Henry about whatever he was hiding, it could have led to a confrontation that spiraled out of control. But there was still the question of John's involvement, and whether Henry's secret had anything to do with his shady business dealings. Karen's testimony also introduced another possibility, that someone else had learned of the affair and had taken matters into their own hands. If John wasn't the killer, then they needed to find out who else had a motive to commit the murders. As Karen left the station, Detective Carter knew they were closer to the truth, but they still had a long way to go. The investigation was now focused on uncovering the secrets Henry had been hiding and determining whether those secrets had led to his and Sophia's deaths. The breakthrough came when the detectives dug deeper into Henry Miller's business dealings. They uncovered a series of financial transactions that led them to a disturbing conclusion. Henry had been involved in a money laundering scheme with connections to organized crime. This was the secret he had been hiding from Sophia, and it was a secret that had the potential to destroy not only his life, but hers as well. Henry had been laundering money through his legitimate business, but things had started to unravel. He owed a significant amount of money to some very dangerous people, and they were beginning to lose patience. Henry was desperate to cover his tracks, but it was clear that he was running out of time. The detectives also discovered that in the days leading up to the murders, Henry had transferred a large sum of money to an offshore account, money that he was likely planning to use to disappear. But before he could make his escape, someone had decided to take matters into their own hands. With this new information, the detectives turned their attention back to Gerald Henson, Henry's former business partner. They discovered that Henson had been aware of Henry's illegal activities and had been using that knowledge to blackmail him. When Henry refused to pay, Henson had likely decided to eliminate the problem altogether. The final piece of the puzzle came when the detectives received the results of the DNA analysis from the crime scene. The blood found in the garage matched Gerald Henson, placing him at the scene of the murders. It was the evidence they needed to link him to the crime. Detective Carter and his team moved quickly, arresting Gerald Henson and bringing him in for questioning. Under the weight of the evidence against him, Henson confessed to the murders. He admitted that he had killed Henry out of revenge, but when Sophia discovered him at the scene, he had panicked and killed her as well to cover his tracks. With Henson's confession, the case was finally solved. The tangled web of lies, betrayal, and forbidden romance had led to a tragic and deadly conclusion. John Miller, though deeply hurt by the revelation of his wife's affair, was ultimately cleared of any involvement in the murders. The truth, though painful, had been uncovered, and justice had been served. The town of New Brunswick was left reeling from the events that had unfolded. The peaceful community would never be the same, forever marked by the dark secrets that had been exposed. But for Detective Carter and his team, the case was closed, and they could finally begin to put the pieces of the puzzle to rest. With the confession of Gerald Henson, the case of the Miller murders was officially closed. However, the impact of the crime would linger for a long time, both in the small town of New Brunswick and in the lives of those directly involved. John Miller, though cleared of any criminal involvement, found himself grappling with the emotional fallout from the events. The revelation of his wife's affair with his stepfather was devastating, but it was the manner of their deaths that haunted him most. The knowledge that his marriage had been a lie and that it had ended in such violence left him feeling shattered and adrift. He had lost not only his wife, but also the man who had been a father figure to him for years. After the case was closed, John chose to leave New Brunswick. The memories tied to the town were too painful to bear, and he needed a fresh start away from the whispers and the sorrow that followed him everywhere he went. He moved to a different state, far from the place that had been the setting for so much tragedy, hoping to rebuild his life piece by piece. Detective Samuel Carter, who had led the investigation, also found himself reflecting on the case. He was no stranger to the darker aspects of human nature, but the complexity and emotional weight of this case had left a mark on him as well. The forbidden romance, the lies, the betrayal, and the eventual deadly outcome, all of it spoke to the fragile and often dangerous nature of human relationships. Carter knew that while justice had been served, the scars left by the crime would never fully heal. The town of New Brunswick, once a quiet and peaceful place, was now associated with a crime that had shocked the entire community. The story of Sophia and Henry Miller, and the man who had killed them in a fit of vengeful rage, would be retold for years to come, a dark chapter in the town's history. For the residents of New Brunswick, the events that had unfolded served as a grim reminder that even in the most seemingly tranquil places, darkness could lurk beneath the surface. The people who had once seen Henry Miller as a respected figure in the community now viewed him with suspicion and contempt, his hidden life exposed in the most tragic of ways. In the weeks following Gerald Henson's confession, the case moved swiftly through the legal system. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His DNA at the crime scene, the financial records linking him to Henry's illicit activities, and his own admission of guilt left little room for doubt. Henson was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, as well as additional charges related to his involvement in money laundering and other criminal activities. The trial was brief, as his defense team had little to contest given the weight of the evidence. The prosecution presented a clear and compelling case, detailing Henson's motive, the calculated nature of the murders, and the steps he had taken to cover his tracks. During the trial, John Miller made the difficult decision to attend, seeking closure and hoping to find some semblance of peace. Sitting in the courtroom, he listened as the details of his wife's affair and the events leading up to the murders were laid bare. It was a painful experience, but one he felt he needed to endure to finally move forward. In the end, the jury found Gerald Henson guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fitting punishment for the crimes he had committed. The judge, in delivering the sentence, remarked on the cold and calculated nature of the murders, emphasizing the impact Henson's actions had on the community and the lives of those left behind. For John, the sentencing brought a sense of closure, though it did little to alleviate the pain of his loss. He knew that no amount of justice could bring back Sophia or erase the betrayal he had suffered. But knowing that Henson would spend the rest of his life behind bars provided a measure of solace. The residents of New Brunswick also felt a sense of relief. With Henson behind bars, they could begin the slow process of healing and returning to some semblance of normalcy. But the memory of the crime would not be easily forgotten, and for many, the story of the Miller murders would remain a haunting reminder of the hidden dangers that could lurk even in the most unexpected places. As the dust settled on the case, Detective Samuel Carter took some time to reflect on the investigation and the lives that had been irrevocably changed by the events that had unfolded. The Miller murders were more than just another case. They were a stark reminder of the complexities of human nature and the destructive power of secrets. In his career, Carter had seen the full spectrum of human behavior, from acts of great kindness to moments of unimaginable cruelty. This case, however, had struck a particular chord. It wasn't just the violence of the crime that stayed with him. It was the tangled web of relationships, the hidden lives, and the way in which desire, fear, and betrayal had converged to create a deadly outcome. The case of Sophia and Henry Miller, and the subsequent revelation of their forbidden romance, was a story that would resonate far beyond the borders of New Brunswick. It was a story that spoke to the dangers of hidden passions, the fragility of trust, and the lengths to which people would go to protect their secrets. For the residents of New Brunswick, life would eventually return to normal, but the memory of the Miller murders would linger, casting a shadow over the town. The house where the murders took place was eventually sold, but it remained vacant for years, a physical reminder of the tragedy that had occurred within its walls. As for Detective Carter, the case became one of those that would stay with him for the rest of his career. It served as a constant reminder of the importance of vigilance, the need for empathy, and the understanding that behind every crime, there was a story of human beings caught in the web of their own choices, desires, and fears. In the end, the story of the Miller murders was one of tragedy, but also of justice. And as Carter closed the file on the case, he knew that while the book on the Miller murders had been closed, its echoes would be felt for a long time to come, a somber reminder of the dark secrets that can lurk in even the most seemingly ordinary lives.